there's a bronze statue standing on the banks of the Garonne River in Bordeaux, France. It depicts a woman gazing out across the water, broken chains at her feet. Her name was Modeste Testas, though that wasn't the name she was born with. And her story takes us from the highlands of East Africa to the elegant streets of a French port city, from the sugar fields of Haiti to a legacy that reached the presidential palace. This is the story of a woman who lived through 105 years of history, whose life embodied the brutal mechanics of the transatlantic slave trade and its aftermath, and whose descendants would help shape a nation born from revolution. In the year 1765, somewhere in the highlands of what we now call Ethiopia, a girl was born. Her name was Al-Puesi. We don't know the specific region, don't know the exact community, don't have records of her parents or her early childhood. What we do know comes from oral history passed down through her descendants, particularly through the meticulous research of Lorraine Manuel Steed, a Haitian designer and descendant of Al-Puesi, who spent 15 years piecing together this story from family papers, archives, and historical records. According to these accounts, Al-Puesi grew up in a world that had known slavery for centuries, but not the chattel slavery that would define her life. Ethiopia in the 18th century was a complex patchwork of kingdoms and societies where slavery existed in various forms, regulated by customary law and religious tradition, particularly the Fetha Nagast, the law of the kings that had governed Christian Ethiopian societies since the 15th century. When Al-Puesi was 14 years old, around 779, her world shattered. She was captured in a raid, the result of what sources describe as a dispute between tribes. This was how most slaves in Ethiopia were acquired in that era, through raids, wars, kidnapping, or as punishment for crimes. The Ethiopian highlands and the Rift Valley regions were often targeted for slave raids, and captives were then funneled into trade routes that had connected this region to the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean world since ancient times. But Al-Puesi's captors had different plans. She wasn't destined for the traditional slave markets of the Red Sea coast or the ancient routes to Arabia. Instead, she was taken westward across the African continent, a journey of thousands of miles, moving through territories and cultures until she reached the western coast of Africa. We can't know the specific details of this journey, how long it took, what Al-Puesi endured along the way, who held her as she moved from one set of hands to another. What we know is that she ended up on the West African coast, swept into the machinery of the Atlantic slave trade. The intra-African slave trade that brought her west was itself part of a larger, interconnected system, and by the late 1770s, the Atlantic trade was at its peak. Ships from France, Britain, Portugal, Spain, and other European nations were crossing the ocean with devastating regularity, and the French port of Bordeaux was deeply involved in this commerce. Between 1672 and 1837, ships departed from Bordeaux on approximately 500 triangular trade voyages. These ships would leave Bordeaux loaded with wine, cloth, arms, and manufactured goods, sail to the western coast of Africa, where these goods would be exchanged for human beings, then cross the Atlantic in what's known as the Middle Passage, delivering enslaved Africans to the Caribbean colonies, particularly Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. The ships would then return to Bordeaux filled with sugar, coffee, cotton, and other plantation goods. The death rate during the Middle Passage typically ranged between 10 and 20%. Of the approximately 150,000 Africans deported through Bordeaux's involvement in the slave trade, tens of thousands died before ever reaching the Americas. Somewhere between 778 and 1781, Alpuesi was purchased by two brothers from Bordeaux, named Pierre and François Testas. They were merchants and slave traders who had built their fortune on the triangular trade. The brothers owned a sugar plantation in Jérémie, a town on the northern coast of what's now Haiti's southern peninsula, in a region known during the colonial period as La Grande Anse. Pierre Testas managed their operations in Bordeaux from his home on Rue Huguerie, handling the sale of sugar and cotton that arrived from their Caribbean holdings. François Testas ran the plantation itself in Saint-Domingue. They were part of a merchant class that had made Bordeaux wealthy. By the 1780s, Bordeaux benefited more than any other French city from the plantations in Saint-Domingue, even though the city sent fewer slave ships than Nantes. The reason was simple. Many of Saint-Domingue's most profitable plantations were run by Bordeaux merchants. Before being transported to the Caribbean, Alpuesi was taken to Bordeaux itself. This wasn't unusual. Slave traders sometimes brought enslaved people to France temporarily, and Bordeaux's proximity to the Caribbean made it a logical transit point. In 1781, the Testas brothers had Alpuesi baptized in Bordeaux, erasing her birth name and giving her a new one, Marthe Adélaïde Modeste Testas. The name Testas marked her as property of their household. She would never use her birth name again. The baptism was both a religious ceremony and a legal formality, a way of documenting ownership and incorporating an enslaved person into the French colonial system. That same year, 1781, François Testas transported the 16-year-old girl to his plantation in Jérémie. The journey across the Atlantic typically took 6 to 8 weeks under favorable conditions, though storms, disease, and other complications could extend it considerably. Saint-Domingue in the 1780s was the wealthiest colony in the world. It produced approximately 40% of all the sugar and 60% of all the coffee consumed in Europe. The colony's economy was built entirely on the labor of enslaved Africans, and by 1789 there were about 500,000 enslaved people in Saint-Domingue compared to roughly 30,000 white colonists. Of those colonists, about 40% came from Bordeaux and the surrounding region. The area around Jérémie had experienced a coffee boom during the 1790s and 1780s. The highlands weren't suitable for sugar cultivation, so most plantations there grew coffee, along with cacao and cotton as secondary crops. But a handful of sugar plantations existed on the coast near the town of Jérémie itself, and the Testas brothers owned one of these coastal sugar operations. Sugar cultivation was the most profitable and also the most brutal form of plantation agriculture. It required enormous capital investment. Contemporary estimates suggested a full sugar plantation cost about 700,000 livres to build, equip, and staff, roughly equivalent to nearly $9 million in modern terms. Each sugar plantation required at least 100 enslaved workers, and the work itself was grueling and dangerous. Newly arrived Africans were particularly numerous in La Grande Anse's enslaved population during this period. The average life expectancy for enslaved people on Saint-Domingue's plantations was 5 to 6 years. Modeste Testas, as she was now called, became both an enslaved worker and the concubine of François Testas. Let's be clear about what this means, because the language of the historical record often obscures the reality. An enslaved woman could not consent to a sexual relationship with her enslaver. This wasn't a romance, wasn't a consensual arrangement, it was rape sustained over years. François Testas owned Modeste, controlled every aspect of her life, held complete power over her. She bore him 2 children during her years on the plantation, though the historical record doesn't preserve their names or what became of them. The 1780s and early 1790s were turbulent years in Saint-Domingue. The French Revolution began in 1789, and its promises of liberty, equality, and brotherhood created expectations among all of Saint-Domingue's populations, from the wealthy white planters to the free people of color who owned property and slaves themselves but were denied full civil rights, to the hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans who made up the overwhelming majority of the colony's population. In August 1791, after a Vodou ceremony at Bois-Cayman, enslaved people in the northern plains around Cap Français rose in rebellion. Within weeks, the insurrection included more than 100,000 participants who destroyed hundreds of plantations. Within 2 months, the revolt had killed 2,000 white colonists and burned 280 sugar plantations. The rebellion spread, evolved, took on international dimensions as Britain and Spain tried to seize control of the wealthy colony. The revolution in Saint-Domingue would eventually transform into the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt that established an independent nation. But in the early 1790s, its outcome was far from certain. In La Grande Anse, the region where Jérémie was located, the wealthy white planters took a different approach than their counterparts in other parts of Saint-Domingue. They called in the British to occupy their region, hoping to preserve the status quo and protect their property. Documents from the early 1790s show evidence of planters even arming some of their slaves to defend against the revolutionaries they called brigands. The British occupied La Grande Anse and other parts of western Saint-Domingue from 1793 to 1798, fighting a brutal 5-year war against French Republican forces and the army of formerly enslaved people who had allied with France after the National Convention abolished slavery in all French colonies in 1794. The British occupation of La Grande Anse meant that slavery continued in that region even as it was abolished elsewhere in Saint-Domingue. Eventually, the British were forced to withdraw, losing roughly half their forces to yellow fever and to the military campaigns of Toussaint Louverture and other revolutionary leaders. When the British abandoned Jérémie in 1798, French Republican forces took control. But in 1795, before the British withdrawal, François Testas decided to leave. With the Grande Anse region occupied by British forces and the future uncertain, he fled the colony, taking some of his enslaved workers with him. Among those he brought were Modeste Testas and a man named Joseph L'Espérance, whom sources describe as François' trusted servant or man of confidence. They sailed first to New York, then moved to Baltimore. François Testas was ill. He died in Philadelphia sometime in 1795. Before he died, François Testas did something that would change Modeste's life. He wrote a will, and in that will, he freed the enslaved people he had brought with him to Philadelphia. On July 13, 1795, Modeste Testas became legally free. But François Testas's will came with conditions. He left Modeste 51 carreaux of land, a significant inheritance of approximately 66 hectares, or about 163 acres. 1 carreau was a Haitian unit of measurement equal to about 1.293 hectares. But François also stipulated in his will that Modeste should marry Joseph L'Espérance. We don't know whether Modeste and Joseph had a relationship before this, whether they chose each other, or whether this was simply François's final act of control over the people he had owned. What we know is that Modeste and Joseph returned to Haiti together as free people. Let's pause here to consider what freedom meant in this context. Modeste was no longer enslaved. no longer the property of Modeste Testas or anyone else. But she was returning to a place still convulsed by revolution, where social structures were being torn down and rebuilt, where the meaning of freedom itself was being contested daily. She had land, significant land, but she was a black woman in a society where race and class were intricately intertwined, where the color of your skin and your ancestry determined your legal status and social position. She was, in a sense, one of the lucky ones. Most enslaved people in Saint-Domingue would not gain their freedom until Haiti's independence in 1804, and many would not survive to see that day. Modeste and Joseph settled on the land she had inherited, located near Jérémie, about a half-league from the town. The property was known as the Testas estate, named after the family that had enslaved her. They built a life there together. Historical sources indicate they had either 7 or 9 children together. Sources vary on the exact number. Their daughter was named Tinette L'Espérance, and it's through Tinette that Modeste's legacy would eventually reach the highest levels of Haitian politics. The years following Modeste's return to Haiti were tumultuous for the new nation. Toussaint Louverture had taken control of Saint-Domingue by 1801, declaring himself governor-general for life and attempting to restore plantation agriculture while maintaining the abolition of slavery. But Napoleon Bonaparte had other plans. In 1802, he sent an army under his brother-in-law General Leclerc to retake the colony and reimpose French control. The French briefly succeeded in capturing Toussaint through deception. He was shipped to France, where he died in prison at Fort de Joux in the Jura Mountains in April 1803. But the revolution continued under new leadership, particularly Jean-Jacques Dessalines. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines declared the independence of Haiti, the first black republic and the second independent nation in the Americas after the United States. Haiti's independence came at an enormous cost. The War of Independence had devastated the plantation economy. Sugar plantations that had made Saint-Domingue the wealthiest colony in the world were burned, abandoned, or broken up. The new Haitian government faced international isolation, particularly from slave-holding nations like the United States and the European powers. France eventually recognized Haiti's independence in 1825, but only after Haiti agreed to pay an indemnity of 150 million francs to compensate former plantation owners for their lost property, including the enslaved people they had owned. This debt, which was later reduced to 90 million francs but still took Haiti until 1947 to fully repay, crippled the nation's economy for generations. Through all of this, Modeste Testas remained on her land near Jérémie. She had survived capture in Ethiopia, the Middle Passage, years of enslavement on a sugar plantation, the upheavals of revolution, and the birth of a nation. She was a witness to one of the most transformative periods in modern history, though the historical record preserves almost none of her own words or thoughts about these events. What we have, instead, is the bare outline of her survival, the facts of her longevity, and the legacy of her descendants. Her daughter, Tinette L'Espérance, had a son named François-Denis Légitime, born on November 20, 1841, in Jérémie. François-Denis Légitime would become one of Haiti's most significant political figures in the late 19th century. He served in various military and political roles during the government of Fabre-Geffrard, working as adjutant general. He was aide-de-camp during the government of Sylvain Salnave, and he became Secretary of State of the Interior and then Secretary of State of the Interior and Agriculture during the government of Lysias Salomon. During the Salomon administration, Légitime was accused of having presidential ambitions, which led him to flee to Kingston, Jamaica, where he remained for 3 years. In 1888, Haiti was once again in political turmoil. President Salomon faced a revolt led by General Seydou Télémaque at Cap-Haïtien on August 4th, which resulted in the return of former President Boisrond Canal to Port-au-Prince. Salomon left the presidency, and a provisional government was established on August 24th. But the victors soon turned on each other. Télémaque was killed on September 28th. On October 7, 1888, François-Denis Légitime returned from Jamaica at the invitation of his followers and was elected president of the provisional government. When General Télémaque's supporters denounced the election as fraudulent, and Télémaque attempted to make himself president, a battle ensued in which Télémaque was killed. On December 16, 1888, Légitime was formally elected President of Haiti by the National Constituent Assembly for a 7-year term. But Légitime's presidency was contested from the start. On October 2, 1888, even before his formal election, another insurrection had broken out at Cap-Haïtien, led by General Florville Hippolyte. Haiti found itself in a civil war, with Légitime controlling Port-au-Prince in the south, while Hippolyte controlled the north. The war lasted through 1889. On August 5, 1889, Hippolyte's forces besieged Port-au-Prince. Légitime was forced to flee. He returned to Jamaica, where he would remain until 1896, when President Tiresias Simon Sam granted a general amnesty. Légitime returned to Haiti and lived there until his death on July 29, 1935, at the age of 93. Despite his brief presidency, historians remember him as an attempted reformer who sought to modernize Haiti's institutions. Modeste Testas lived to see her grandson become president, though it's unclear whether she understood the full significance of his brief presidency or witnessed its tumultuous end. She died in 1870 on the Testas estate near Jérémie at the age of 105. Think about that for a moment. She had been born in 1765, the same year that the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act that helped ignite the American Revolution. She was 11 when the Declaration of Independence was signed, 16 when she was transported to Saint-Domingue, 30 when the French Revolution began, 26 when the slave revolt started in Saint-Domingue, 39 when Haiti declared its independence. She lived through the entire Haitian Revolution, through Napoleon's empire and its fall, through the restoration of the French monarchy, through the U.S. Civil War. She outlived everyone who had enslaved her, outlived the system that had enslaved her, outlived the colony where she had been enslaved. For more than a century after her death, Modeste Testas was largely forgotten outside her own family. The oral history of her life was preserved by her descendants, particularly the account passed down to Lorraine Manuel Steed, who conducted 15 years of research to reconstruct her ancestors' story. But in the early 21st century, as Bordeaux began to reckon more seriously with its history as France's second-largest slave port, Modeste Testas became a symbol of that history. In 2016, the city of Bordeaux created a commission of academics, cultural professionals, and representatives from relevant associations to propose ways to commemorate the city's involvement in the slave trade. The commission recommended several initiatives, including creating a memorial route through the city, establishing dedicated rooms in the Musée d'Aquitaine focused on Bordeaux's role in slavery, and commissioning public art. One of the most significant outcomes was the decision to honor Modeste Testas with a statue. The statue was created by Woodley Caimite, a Haitian sculptor known professionally as Filippo. Standing 1.7 meters tall and cast in bronze at the Fonderie des Cyclopes, The statue depicts Modeste gazing across the Garonne River toward the Atlantic. Her expression is melancholic, contemplative. At her feet lie broken chains, symbolizing both the bondage she endured and the freedom she eventually gained. The statue was unveiled on May 10, 2019, on France's National Day commemorating the slave trade, slavery, and their abolition. It stands on the Quai Louis XVIII, along the waterfront where ships once departed for the triangular trade. The choice of Modeste Testas for this memorial was deliberate, but also controversial. She was an enslaved woman, but she was also freed, inherited land, and lived to an extraordinary age. Critics pointed out that she wasn't a revolutionary, didn't fight against slavery, wasn't part of the armed resistance that ultimately destroyed the system. After gaining her freedom and returning to Haiti, she presumably employed laborers on her land, which by then was independent Haiti, but still struggling with what freedom meant for agricultural labor. There's no record of her participating in the revolutionary movement that convulsed Saint-Domingue, though given that she was on a plantation in a British-occupied region, her options for resistance would have been severely limited. But perhaps that's precisely why her story matters. Not everyone who was enslaved became a revolutionary leader. Not everyone had the opportunity to fight in the wars of independence. Most people who were enslaved lived and died in bondage, their names unrecorded, their stories lost. Modeste was lucky, if we can use that word, to survive, to gain freedom through the death of her enslaver, to have land to return to live long enough that her story could be preserved and passed down through her descendants. Her life represents the experience of countless others whose names we don't know, who didn't become presidents or generals or famous rebels, who simply endured and survived and built lives in the aftermath of slavery. The statue also represents something else, the growing willingness of European cities that profited from the slave trade to acknowledge that history publicly. Bordeaux sent approximately 500 ships on triangular trade voyages between 1670 and 1837, resulting in the deportation of at least 150,000 Africans. The wealth generated by this trade, and by the plantation goods that flowed back to Bordeaux, shaped the city's architecture, its institutions, its mercantile class. Streets in Bordeaux were named after slave traders and plantation owners. The wine industry that made Bordeaux famous was exported to Saint-Domingue and consumed by the plantation elite. Bordeaux's merchants owned or had investments in hundreds of Saint-Domingue's plantations. For most of the 20th century, this history was treated as a taboo subject in Bordeaux. But in the early 2000s, activists like Carfa Diallo of the organization Mémoires et Partage began pushing the city to confront its past. In December 2019, the city added explanatory plaques to street signs bearing the names of slave traders, providing historical context rather than removing the names entirely. The Musée d'Aquitaine created permanent exhibitions on the Atlantic slave trade and Bordeaux's role in it. Walking tours were developed to educate residents and visitors about this history. These efforts parallel similar initiatives in other former slave ports like Nantes, Bristol, and Liverpool. When the statue of Modeste Testas was vandalized in September 2021, covered in white plaster by what officials initially feared was a racist attack, the incident sparked intense debate. The perpetrator turned out to be an art student who claimed to have no racist motive, but the incident highlighted the ongoing tensions around how European societies commemorate slavery. Some see monuments like Modeste's statue as necessary acts of remembrance and education. Others see them as insufficient gestures that don't address ongoing inequalities rooted in slavery's legacy. And still others resent any acknowledgement of this history at all. Modeste Testas never sought to be a symbol. She was simply trying to survive, to build a life for herself and her children in circumstances not of her choosing. But her life tells us important things about the Atlantic slave trade and its aftermath. It reminds us that the trade reached into Ethiopia, far from the West African coast most associated with the Atlantic trade. It shows us the international reach of slave trading networks, the way African captives could travel thousands of miles across the continent before being forced across the ocean. It illustrates the intimate brutality of slavery, the way enslaved women were sexually exploited by their enslavers, bearing children in circumstances of complete powerlessness. Her story also shows us the contingency of freedom. She gained her liberty not through revolt or escape, but through the death of the man who enslaved her, and only because he chose to include her manumission in his will. Thousands of other enslaved people in similar circumstances remained enslaved when their owners died, passed on as property to heirs. Modeste was fortunate in this, if nothing else. And what she did with that freedom matters too. She returned to Haiti, to land she had inherited, land associated with her former enslavement. She married, had children, built a family. She lived long enough to see her descendants thrive, to see one of them reach the presidency of the nation born from slave revolt. In 2019, when descendants of Modeste Testas traveled to Bordeaux for the statue's unveiling, they carried with them oral histories and family records that helped fill in details of her life. The connection between Haiti and Bordeaux embodied in Modeste's story is part of a larger pattern of connections forged by the slave trade, connections that persist today through family ties, through cultural exchange, through the ongoing work of remembering and reckoning with history. The statue on the Quai Louis XIX stands as a reminder that slavery wasn't an abstract system, but involved real people with names, families, stories, people who endured unimaginable trauma and sometimes survived to tell about it or have their descendants tell about it. Modeste Testas was born Al-Pouessi in Ethiopia in 1765. She was captured at 14, transported across Africa, sold in West Africa, bought by Bordeaux merchants, taken to France, baptized with a new name, shipped to Saint-Domingue, enslaved on a sugar plantation for 14 years, raped by her enslaver, bore children in bondage, gained freedom when her enslaver died, inherited land, returned to Haiti, married, built a family, lived through the Haitian Revolution and its aftermath, saw Haiti become independent, saw her grandson become president, and died at 105 on land she owned. That one person could contain all of that history, could embody so many transformations, could bridge so many worlds, Africa to Europe to the Americas, slavery to freedom, colonial rule to independence, that's what makes her story worth remembering. Not because she was exceptional, though living to 105 certainly was, but because her story helps us understand what millions of others experienced, the ones whose names we don't know, whose stories weren't preserved, who didn't have descendants who could research and reconstruct their lives for 15 years. Modeste Testas represents all of them. The statue looking out over the Garonne River toward the Atlantic, toward the route that brought her from Africa to France to Haiti, stands for all the people whose names are lost, but whose labor and suffering and survival made the modern world. When we think about the legacy of slavery, we often focus on the economic impact, the way slave labor built fortunes and industries and nations. And that's true and important. But we should also think about the human legacy, the families that descended from enslaved people, the stories that were preserved despite every effort to erase them, the way that people like Modeste Testas refused to be forgotten, even if only through the persistence of their descendants. Her grandson, François Denis Légitime, left writings, documents, a political legacy that helped researchers trace the family history backward to his grandmother. Her descendant, Lorraine Manuel Steed, spent 15 years researching, traveling to archives in Haiti and France, piecing together fragments into a coherent story. That work of remembrance, of insisting that these lives mattered and should be known, is its own kind of resistance to the dehumanization of slavery. Bordeaux is still grappling with what it means to have been France's second-largest slave port, what responsibilities come with that history, how to educate new generations about it without inspiring guilt but with honesty and clarity. The statue of Modeste Testas is part of that process, but it's not the end of it. The work of memory and education and reckoning continues. Other cities are going through similar processes. Bristol in England has confronted its history as a major slave port. Nantes in France installed a memorial to the abolition of slavery in 2012. Liverpool, Charleston, New Orleans, all cities shaped by slavery, are finding ways to acknowledge that history in public spaces. What makes Modeste Testas's story particularly powerful is the way it connects these places. Her body traveled the routes of the triangular trade. She lived in 3 continents. She personally experienced the transition from slavery to freedom, from colonial rule to independence. She embodied the history of the Atlantic world in the age of revolution, and she survived to an age that let her witness the long-term consequences of those transformations. When she died in 1870, Haiti had been independent for 66 years, but was still struggling with political instability, economic challenges, and the burden of the indemnity France had imposed. The United States had just ended its own civil war and abolished slavery. Europe was in the midst of a new wave of colonial expansion into Africa and Asia. The world Modeste Testas left in 1870 was vastly different from the one she had entered in 1765, and she had lived through much of what made it different. There's something almost mythical about a life spanning 105 years, more than a full century of history compressed into one person's memory and experience. But Modeste Testas was real. She was born with a different name in Ethiopia. She was captured and enslaved. She crossed an ocean in chains. She labored on a plantation. She was raped by the man who owned her. She bore children. She gained freedom. She owned land. She married. She raised a family. She lived through revolution. She witnessed the birth of a nation. She saw her grandson become president. She died on land she had inherited from the man who enslaved her. All of this is documented, can be traced through archives and family records and historical research. Her life actually happened. And because it happened, because it can be documented and verified, it stands as proof that all the others happened too. All the lives that weren't documented, all the people who were captured and transported and enslaved, and who somehow, incredibly, survived and persisted, and passed on their stories to children and grandchildren who kept those stories alive. The bronze statue on the Bordeaux waterfront is 1.7 meters tall, human-sized, not heroic or monumental in scale. That's intentional. Modeste Testas wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. She was a person, a woman who endured what was done to her and made a life afterward. The statue shows her at human scale because that's what she was, human. Not a symbol or an abstraction, but a real person whose life matters precisely because it was ordinary in the context of slavery's horrors. Millions of people experienced capture, the Middle Passage, plantation labor, sexual exploitation. Not all of them lived to 105. Not all of them gained freedom. Not all of them had descendants who became presidents. But what happened to them happened to her. And because we know her name, because we can reconstruct her life, she helps us remember all of them. That's the legacy of Modeste Testas, born al Puesi. Not that she changed history through heroic action, but that she survived it, that she persisted through it, that she built a life and a family despite it, and that her story was preserved when so many others were lost. The statue looking out over the water, the broken chains at her feet, the melancholic expression. It's all there to remind us that slavery was real, that it involved real people with names and lives and families, and that its legacy persists in the descendants of both enslaved and enslavers, in the cities that grew wealthy from the trade, in the nations born from slave revolt, in all of us who inherited this history, whether we acknowledge it or not. Modeste Testas lived 105 years. She died in 1870. But her story lives on in archives and oral histories, in academic research and family memories, in a bronze statue on a French riverbank, in the ongoing work of remembering and understanding what slavery was and what it did, and what we owe to those who endured it.